On behalf of the University of Colorado Boulder, welcome to the 73rd Conference on World Affairs, an annual event attracting thought leaders and experts from around the world to our campus. Usually, this week is marked by a bustling campus of students, community members, and alumni. But in an effort to keep everyone safe, this year's conference is virtual, with speakers joining conversations remotely. We look forward to the day when we can host you all again for in-person events. But for now, we're grateful for your continued support by enjoying the conference from home. I'm sure you'll like this year's lineup of more than 80 speakers addressing a variety of topics, including this year's conference themes: racism in the U.S., healthcare, and Generation Z. I want to thank CWA Faculty Director John Griffin and CWA Program Chair Lori Leinonen for fostering this long-standing university and community collaboration. This partnership has helped make the CWA successful for more than 70 years. I also want to applaud the efforts of the entire CWA Program Committee of CU students and community volunteers who showed great resilience in assembling an impressive program under challenging circumstances. Congratulations to the Conference on World Affairs for another successful event. Enjoy the conference and go Buffs!
Go Buffs indeed, and welcome to the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel, America in the World. I'm CU President Mark Kennedy, and I'm thrilled to be here and have a conversation with Bob Zoellick, who I've known for the last several decades as he served as President of the World Bank. Also as U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, he's now a Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and author of the book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. Before we dive in, I'd like to first express my deepest condolences to the families of those killed in the recent mass shooting and to the entire Boulder community. My heart goes out for all those impacted by this horrific event. I want to remind you, the audience, that you can submit questions for Bob at any time during the session via YouTube chat. If you're a CU student, please let us know that, and also let us know where you're joining us from. If you haven't read Bob's book, America in the World, I urge you to do so. It's a comprehensive and highly engaging account of the history of American diplomacy and foreign policy. As Bob himself describes it, it's a book of stories about the history of American diplomacy. I typically underline passages of interest in books I read, and I find myself underlining virtually the whole book. Bob, to kick things off, why did you write this book?
Well, first, Mark, let me thank you for the privilege of being with you in the CU community. I should share with our audience before we begin, Mark and I have known each other for many years. We first worked together when he was a member of Congress from Minnesota, and I've admired his career in education and business. But most of all, appropriate for this conference, he's always been an ardent internationalist. And I also appreciate the opportunity to be with the university. It's a admired and leading school, and I share Mark's sympathy for the tragic events. I noted the chancellor, though, also said that one of the points of this conference was Generation Z. So I think it's only appropriate that you invite somebody whose surname begins with Z. We're often last in the list, so I'm glad that we could fit in. So the reason I wrote the book, I hope will actually appeal, Mark, to many of the students in the audience. Because when I was in government, I often drew upon history as I thought about problems. And I wanted to encourage others, particularly of coming generations. Many of you are well aware that foreign policy courses tend to focus on international relations theories. And they're interesting. They're a challenge to debate. But my experience was they were not of great use when I dealt with issues as ranging from German unification to trade strategies or Darfur or China policy or the World Bank and development. And instead, what I try to do in the book is focus on the practical problem-solving nature. And some people who've studied foreign policy will recall that Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy in the 1990s, where he focused on history and foreign policy. But Kissinger tends to write from what people refer to as the realpolitik perspective. Really, it's a European tradition. So the idea for this book was to try to focus on some of the American experience and ideas. And I suppose one other aspect was that in those various positions you mentioned, Mark, I often had younger colleagues. And I suppose I tortured them a little bit with questions about history because I honestly didn't know how much they learned. And I discovered, insofar as they had learned history, it tended to be from World War II on. And the first 150 years of American history are full of fascinating people that I wanted to draw back from the mists of time. And I suppose the last point is that I try to approach the challenges of the future as well as the past with a bit of optimism. And I'd like to believe that history can offer insights on how to do better, not just a sense of timeless obstacles.
It is a great way to approach it. And as you describe the American approach as opposed to the more European approach that Kissinger puts forth in diplomacy, you describe American foreign policy largely as being pragmatic. Can you elaborate on that and the degree to which pragmatism has been at the heart of American foreign policy?
Well, as people who've studied a little philosophy know, probably the greatest American contribution to the field of philosophy was pragmatism with William James and John Dewey, with the simple notion that people need to understand the practical consequences that flow from experience. So as I tried to relate that idea to diplomacy, I was making the point about some caution about overuse of abstractions or trying to force messy facts into intellectual frameworks or theoretical boxes. And instead, the concentration, which I believe characterizes the reality of the American experience, is trying to focus on what works. And that starts with means and some sense of applying them to ends. And in particular, for foreign policy, it requires a sense of the realities on the ground. Those realities relate to power, sometimes military, sometimes economic, sometimes technology, sometimes values and ideas, sometimes, as you know, the question of votes. And then there's a key role about understanding processes and institutions, how things get done, how they work. You need to know the positions of others and their interests because you operate not alone, but in a larger context. Pragmatism recognizes the role of chance and contingency, and it has often an important sense of timing, when to act, when not to act. And again, on the theme of how we can learn from history, I think it's useful to appreciate that imperfect results in a far from perfect world can sometimes still be a good day. Perpetual peace is not going to be so easy to achieve in anybody's career, but one can still create good marks that others can build on.
We certainly hope we can. And I want to get eventually to your 5 traditions of American diplomacy, but I was really struck by your 6 factors in the chapter on Lyndon Johnson and what went wrong in Vietnam. And these 6 factors I would encourage people to review as one way of just evaluating any current policy to see how we're doing. And amongst those 6 factors were the idea that we too often view military power and diplomacy as separate, and we don't mix them. Even if you go all the way back to the time of Jefferson negotiating with the French over the Louisiana Purchase, he mixed them, but you mentioned that we didn't mix them as well as we could in Vietnam. Can you tell us how these reinforce each other and why there's a tradition of separating them?
Yeah, let me just start a little bit with the Vietnam chapter. Many of the stories in the books are of things that at least work out reasonably well. But I had a seminar of faculty and graduate students at Harvard as I was preparing the chapters. And they made a point, which I think was a good one, which was that I had to focus on the tragedy in Vietnam. So that chapter really focuses on a narrow window. It focuses on late 1964, early 1965, and Lyndon Johnson's decisions to really take over the ground war. Now, there's been a lot of good research on that done. Fred Logoval at Harvard's written some wonderful books. So that chapter, even more than most, I try to add my assessment sort of based on my policy experience. And that led to the 6 factors you mentioned, which, by the way, may be useful for people to think about with other military interventions. But what your question draws on, it's a point that Kissinger has made, is that Americans tend to view military action as distinct from the diplomacy. You conduct the warfare and then you turn over to the diplomacy. And there's some truth in that in some of the American experience. But as you suggested, actually, there are a number of counterexamples. And so it really even starts even before our independence. So my introduction focuses on Ben Franklin during the Revolution. And early in 1777, one of his colleagues, in frustration, were trying to convince France to become an ally and recognize the United States, argued to Franklin, look, we just need to tell the French it's all on the line and it's either this or nothing. Franklin, of course, holds off until the victory at Saratoga in 1777. And then quite shrewdly, he kind of let the French espionage learn that he's reaching out to the British, which of course lead the French to sign our first 2 treaties in 1778. And again, after Yorktown in 1781, Congress has ordered Franklin actually not to negotiate with the British without the French, but he and John Adams and John Jay decide that actually it's in America's interest to take advantage of the victory, and they work out a very, very, very good deal, stretching the new United States all the way over to the Mississippi. And as you mentioned, with Thomas Jefferson, that chapter is about the Louisiana Purchase. And the basic question I asked was Jefferson lucky or was he good with this amazing accomplishment? And it was a bit of both. But one of the aspects where he's trying to pressure Napoleon to really focus on selling New Orleans was that he threatens 20,000 militiamen moving to New Orleans. Now, frankly, as we learned in the War of 1812, militia weren't so good on long expeditions, but nevertheless, it's part of the leverage he creates. Another excellent one that people have often overlooked is in the Civil War, there's lots of books on generals and battles and slavery and social effects, but very few on the foreign policy. Well, the big issue in foreign policy was how do you avoid foreign intervention? What if Britain and France had recognized the Confederacy? And there was an incident late in 1861 where we almost went to war with Britain. And in that case, Lincoln and his Secretary of State Seward had an interesting rationalization for the withdrawal of what had been the seizure of Confederate commissioners from a British ship, the Trent. And he had a wonderful line. It was one war at a time, was the logic. But then if you think about as America rose to being a world power around 1900, the chapters I have on John Hay and the Open Door, or Teddy Roosevelt mediating the Russo-Japanese War, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's an interesting example where the United States had interest in East Asia and China, but it wasn't really willing to make the military commitments. So it's a diplomatic challenge of how do you play a relatively weak hand, or how do you mediate or balance of others, which is sometimes people get overused to the notion of American power and dominance. And in much of our history, we didn't have it. In 1947-49, which is the great story after World War II of sort of building the alliance system, Marshall and Truman actually start out with the notion that you'd be familiar with, Mark, from your work, is the Marshall Plan as an economic effort to actually avoid sort of a military commitment. But to make it work, you had to add Germany. That creates anxieties with other Western Europeans. It leads to the Berlin crisis, and that leads to NATO. But to give you an example that people might not have thought about from that period, is the point that I've mentioned, and I think it's Kissinger has also raised it, is what if in late 1950, as opposed to MacArthur going all the way to the Yalu and prodding the Chinese intervention that led to the stalemate in the Korean War, what if the United States forces had stopped If you look at the Korean Peninsula, there's a place where it gets quite narrow up on top. What if they had left a little buffer zone? And so they had recovered most of what would have been South Korea and North Korea, but left a little area above, and thereby kind of giving the Chinese the comfort of a buffer zone, but having accomplished our goal. So if you want to think about this today, an issue you think about in the news is the question of Taiwan. Well, the United States has always recognized since the Nixon period and Kissinger a notion that there's only one China. We would have relations with Taiwan, but we wouldn't treat it as an independent country. So a question today that policymakers face is, should our objective be to preserve Taiwan's democracy, its autonomy, its link to the international economy, but not go so far as to recognize an independence, which in my view would probably trigger a conflict with China. So what all these examples emphasize is that the heart of your question is something that has not only been part of our past, but is very much a part of diplomacy today, to consider how military action and your foreign policy objectives have to be integrated.
Too often today, we think of things as either or as opposed to and I think you made a very good case for and, that the two working together result in a better outcome. I'm also curious, and you mentioned it a bit about foreign aid, and it's played a very big role in our diplomacy. It reflects our generosity as a nation, of course, but it's also a mechanism, as you just referred to, that can shape behavior on the global stage. You quote Gregory Fossidal from his book, The Finest Hour, in describing U.S. aid was both a lever to win economic reforms and to thwart communist imperialism. When you refer to Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, how has aid helped to shape global conduct that's more likely to lead to peace and collaboration and not having to have military conflict?
Well, that's a great topic that I imagine a number of the students interested in international affairs are interested in, kind of how aid works in fact for humanitarian or development or other interest purposes. So let's take the one you started with. In terms of pure size, the Marshall Plan over 4 or 5 years was about $14.2 billion. Now, in today's dollars, that'd be about $138 billion. And that amount at that time was about 1.2% of US GDP. So today that'd be about $1 trillion. So that gave a sense of the huge commitment. But as we discussed before, it was really designed to prevent communism from taking advantage of the loss of hope and despair and the breakdown in Western Europe. So it really started out as an economic plan for the recovery, and then it expanded into the notion of the need to protect Western Europe militarily. There are other examples. I've talked about Korea. South Korea was a tremendous success story after the devastation of both the combination of development and now, one of the major democracies of the world. As you know from your time in Congress, support for Israel and then Egypt, in part because the Egypt-Israeli sort of peace accord from the Carter era. Another point I want to draw attention to, given my own experience, was that sometimes the US can give this support most effectively through multilateral institutions. So I was the president of the World Bank, but also you have the IMF. This week, you'll see what are called the spring meetings of the IMF World Bank, and there'll be a question about what support some of the poorest countries should get during the support of the pandemic. And through these institutions, the United States, frankly, leverages its dollars because others contribute as well. In the case of the World Bank, the US contributes capital, and then that money is leveraged to be able to borrow. And you also are able to develop, in my case, a staff from about 180 so countries that are trying to focus on common interest. Another issue one that you and I worked on when you were in the Congress was to connect aid with trade. My own view is that if you really want to have the aid be effective over a longer term, it needs to be connected to strategies for growth. Those often involve sort of trade strategies. So when the US has closed its markets and protectionism, it's basically taken away with one hand what it offers with another with aid. And another one that is from the World Bank, but it's quite relevant today if you think about Central America, is when I was at the World Bank, one of the particular challenges I tried to focus on was the challenges of what you would call post-conflict or fragile states. Central America would be an excellent example, but would have been true with Ivory Coast or other countries in Africa. And the reason I focused on this was I discovered at different points in my career that the people who came from the security side would have a slightly different perspective than people that came from the governance side. And they had a slightly different perspective than people that came from the economic side. And the question is, how do you try to integrate these together? And that will be exactly the challenge you'll see the Biden administration facing in Central America. Then probably a lot of the students are interested in some of the traditional humanitarian support that the US and UN has provided around the world. Some of the farmers in Colorado would have an interest in this because the Food for Peace program started out as an idea of using agricultural surpluses abroad. And then another one that relates to, again, the pandemic today is, you'll recall that President Bush 43, so George W. Bush, initiated the PEPFAR program, HIV/AIDS for sub-Saharan Africa, which even in my visits in Africa years later was probably seen as the greatest US commitment to sub-Saharan Africa dealing with HIV/AIDS. And today, if you think about to really deal with this pandemic, we can't just deal with it in the United States. How will we deal with vaccines and needs around the world? Similarly with climate change, you're not going to really be able to deal with the carbon if you also can't draw in developing countries with issues like forestation or avoided deforestation or soil carbon. And then there's a whole series of issues related to making aid effective, transparency, anti-corruption. Another initiative that Bush 43 had was something called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which you'll recall was an effort to try to focus resources on sort of cornerstone efforts of development for countries that had good governance. So the field of aid, in my view, needs to be seen broadly related to development, humanitarian, but also the larger security of the world in which we work.
Indeed, it does have many benefits. And, one of the key ones that if we do it right, we have less conflict, and that's good for all of us. I'd like to talk about the 5 traditions that you identify that have emerged from America's encounter with the world. They are the importance of North America, the special roles of trading, transnational and technological relationships, and how they define our ties with others, our changing attitudes towards alliances and the way of ordering connections among states, the need for public support, especially through Congress, and the belief that American policy should serve a larger purpose. In discussing North America, the first of those 5 traditions, I don't believe it's fully understood how having friendly neighbors in Canada and Mexico is such a huge advantage to US's ability to act in the world. How do we understand why North America is such an important role for us to have that continent, and how we are stronger as a continent together?
Well, I guess as a leader who started out in Minnesota and then also served some time in North Dakota, you'll have an understanding, Mark, that America actually does have neighbors and borders that we need to have good relations with. But this is one of my favorite topics because if you go on the websites of most foreign policy institutions, you'll find studies of relations with Europe and the Indo-Pacific and usually the Middle East and often Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, almost never on North America. And yet, as I try to talk about in the book, in the 19th century and indeed the 20th century, it was critical to America's development. So people understand it in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, we almost went to war with Mexico again in 1916 and 17. The greatest nuclear showdown of the Cold War was right off our shores in Cuba. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was much more than a trade agreement. It was an effort to try to embrace a changing political system in Mexico and move it towards democracy. And if you think about public interest today in foreign policy, you'll often come up with topics like the environment, immigration, economic interdependence, organized crime or trafficking systems. And of course, that brings you right back to the North American agenda. So one of the quotes I liked that I put in the book was, I discovered that Ronald Reagan, as he was launching his campaign in 1979, gave a speech where he said, the United States would be better off if Mexico and Canada were stronger, not weaker. And it's time that we stop thinking about our nearest neighbors as foreigners. Well, if you ask yourself the rhetoric over the past 4 or 5 years, it's been a little bit different. But I think that's a strategic view, not only for our continental interest, but for our global interest. And that's taking it one step further. I've always viewed North America as the continental base for the United States engagement across the Pacific and Asia and also in Europe. So if we think about North America as 3 democracies, 500 million people, energy self-sufficiency and ability to export, better demographics than the rest of the world if we see people as a human resource as opposed to a problem, effective economic interconnections, well, it puts 1.3 billion Chinese in a slightly different context. And so we need to think about how the 3 economies and democracies of North America can cooperate. And again, to relate this to what your audience may be debating or discussing in the conference, one of the challenges for the new administration will be the implementation of the revised NAFTA, called the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. There are, for example, some labor provisions in that agreement, which could be used in one of 2 ways. They could be used to strengthen labor unions in Mexico, or they could be used in a very protectionist fashion to sort of limit Mexico's trade. And so that will be an important determinant of where we go on these topics. As people think about competition with China, some of the things that are made in China could easily be made in Mexico. You'd have shorter supply and logistics chains. And of course, as you increase Mexican incomes, Mexicans might buy more from the United States. You have issues of the Arctic now that's of importance to Canada, the different transit routes, and of course, issues of border security. And one that we just saw in the business pages over the past couple of weeks was the interesting, at least appears to be a merger of the Canadian Pacific with the Kansas City Southern, which probably runs right also again through the Colorado communities, which is in a sense, the railroad logistic line that would unite all 3 countries in North America. So very practical business sense about what we're talking about with foreign policy.
So as you point out, the foreign policy begins at home with having those good, strong relations with our neighbors. Another tradition I'd like to highlight is the need for public support in successful foreign policy, something I have firsthand experience with, but my time in Congress showed that you need to have strong national leaders and strong congressional leaders to really build that support, explain actions to the American people. You talk about Vandenberg and how he was such an instrumental part of Truman as a partner in advancing the post-World War II framework that served us so well. And do we have these leaders today? What kind of presidential and congressional leaders do we need to act in the world in a way that truly benefits America? And we've had a recent history of strong women leaders in foreign policy, Hillary Clinton and Nikki Haley. How are women helping to shape building the support for foreign policy here in America?
Yeah, this is another aspect of my book that you often will find overlooked in foreign policy studies. Many foreign policy specialists understandably focused abroad, but not on the base of support at home. So George Kennan, who people may have read about or heard about, was a great thinker, but you could see why Atchison never wanted to let him get near the Congress, because he was quite insulting. He wouldn't have been able to get support. And as you mentioned, I use Vandenberg in particular, who was a senator from Michigan, Republican, working with Truman, the Democratic president. And I try to draw out in some detail how Vandenberg worked in Congress, things you'd be familiar with, Mark, but others may not, how he used hearings, and how he used resolutions, how he sort of used language to sort of bring his colleagues together. But I also try to run the theme throughout the book. So I made an allusion when, all the way back with Franklin, how he had to really court the Continental Congress as he was trying to do his negotiations with France as an ally, and then later with Britain. There's a wonderful line, which is after they have the Treaty of 1783, this great accomplishment. One of Franklin's colleagues says, you know, you really have to expect the gratitude of the American people and the Congress. And Franklin says, I've never seen a peace treaty that somebody doesn't complain. So the notion from the Bible that blessed are the peacemakers may be for the next life, but probably not for this one. So keep that in mind as we're doing negotiations. But we talked about the Louisiana Purchase story. In that one, obviously, you're dealing with the Mississippi River, and the Western states were just totally focused on this. It became a political issue. And one of the reasons that Jefferson asked Monroe to go to Paris was Monroe was respected and trusted by Westerners, and it sort of helped him as he did his deal. Woodrow Wilson, in a sense, is the example again of the failure where he really doesn't bring any senators along in his delegation after the World War I and the peace treaty negotiations. He's insensitive to the needs of Congress. He's followed by a man that probably many people have forgotten, Charles Evans Hughes. He went on to become a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, almost became president in 1916. He just lost California by about 3,600 votes. But he has to, in 1921, sort of reestablish the president's authority. So this may sound familiar to you, Mark. Actually, one of the senators of his own party said, it doesn't matter who's Secretary of State. He says the Senate's going to run everything. And so the story in that chapter is how Hughes uses the notion of naval arms control, connects it with Pacific security. Trade, where you were always involved, I have a chapter on a man named Cordell Hull, who in 1934, this is 4 years after the big protectionist Smoot-Hawley tariff, really transforms the whole debate about how trade is done in the United States by shifting authority in leadership to the executive. And as you know, frankly, there were close votes on this from that time forward. It's always been a difficult issue. So as you get to the more modern period, you know, you have people like John McCain, we had Lugar and Nunn. Colorado senators have often played a role internationally. In part, I think some of this comes from the fact that as a farm state, sometimes America's Midwest also recognizes more than people overseas understand the international connectivity of the system. But this will be an issue today, and it's quite interesting. If you look at some of the surveys, like the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Americans generally understand the need to engage in the world, whether on security or economic or other issues. They don't want to do so alone. They want to do so in cooperation. But these polling numbers, as you suggest, are somewhat inchoate. The question is, how will leaders, particularly the president and the executive branch, shape them through a combination of words and deeds? And so, in a sense, I hope one of the things coming out of this conference and your discussions is that when people think about their elected representatives, that they also think about people who will engage America in the world. And on the positive side, you know, what's interesting is, you know, if you look at a number of members of Congress, a lot of them have had some international exposure, either in the military, intelligence agencies. Sometimes it's living abroad or studying abroad. Sometimes it's Peace Corps. Sometimes it's humanitarian efforts. Sometimes it's missionaries. It's quite a diverse group. And so, again, one of the challenges of an effective foreign policy will be drawing that experience together so that America abroad represents America at home. You added the issue of women. And I want to take a moment on that one because in the book, I was somewhat constrained by chronology since the heart of my story sort of ends in 1992. That was before we had women as the secretaries of state. But because I was alert to this, I actually tried to do something in the book that I hope people will find interesting. I tried to emphasize the roles that women could have abroad in the earlier period. And one of those was as authors. So if you think about the Civil War, I talk about the influence of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and which was sold millions of copies in Britain and contributed to the anti-slavery attitude. I draw attention to someone that probably most people at this conference have never heard of, an Austrian woman named Bertha von Sutter, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize because she was emphasizing arbitration. And then I talk about Pearl Buck, who was part of the missionary generations and the children of missionaries in China that shaped American attitudes towards China that really persist today in different ways. And then there's the women scholars who I try to give sort of prominent place, but including actually some wonderful ones starting in the first chapter. But as you think about it today, you're right. You've got sort of Madeleine Albright, the first woman Secretary of State, Condi Rice, Hillary Clinton. We now have the first woman Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, NSC advisors. And here I'll add a little personal note, particularly maybe for some of the sort of women students in the audience. When I was U.S. Trade Representative, 2001 to 2005, about 2/3 of the assistant USTR, so that was the sort of the key negotiating level that I had, were women. And I found that they were actually, they brought some aspects to the negotiations that were excellent to have as part of a team. They were, of course, as firm and effective as the men were, but sometimes the manner and approach was a little bit less threatening or intimidating. It was just a different style, and women would operate different ways. But I found it to be kind of a rich part of kind of a team. And when I went on to the World Bank, I was conscious of this. I had people from 180 some different countries. And I made an effort that among the top 40 executives or so, over half that I appointed were women. And to give a sense of what sort of this could lead to, if you look at the women today who run the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the UN Environmental Program, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, a woman who's on the Morgan Stanley board, PACT, which is a private developmental group. These are all women who I was able to help advance in their career and moved on to bigger and better things. So I think there's a wonderful story here that I hope that women in this audience interested in international affairs will perhaps even look into the background of some of these people because they can become great role models.
Indeed. And we're going to turn to audience questions. I'm going to turn first to a CU student from Broomfield, Colorado, a little bit of rephrasing of their question. What are your thoughts on the trade-offs of a more realist American first foreign policy versus a set of policies that seek to generate multinational benefits?
So as the book describes, America first is a term that has its own history. And as history often is, it's rich with irony. It was first actually used by Woodrow Wilson before going into World War I. And his use of the term was not an isolationist use. His use of the term, remember, in 1914, 15, 16, you had very large immigrant communities. And some of them were German Americans, Irish Americans, others that were sensitive to different parties of the war. And he used the term to emphasize the unity of America, e pluribus unum, so as to say we have to stick together to be effective. Now, in the 1930s, America first was associated with Lindbergh and others that was the isolationists trying to avoid the war and conflict. And then Buchanan and Patrick Buchanan in the 90s and Trump more recently used it in a way that tried to emphasize so the American withdrawal. And of course, any of these terms, have multiple meanings. To be honest, I never knew an American official that didn't put America first. But then the question is it America only, or is it America with others? And that goes to your question about the multilateralism. And as Mark explained, one of my themes is I talk about alliances as well as trade and economics. And it's my view of history that the United States is most effective when it worked with others. When it built coalitions or alliances, we could leverage them, we could get their ideas, sometimes we get their money, sometimes their military support. And so my own view is that the Trump approach was highly transactional. And that probably reflected his background. It didn't focus on systems and institutions. And I think the United States lost something in that. There are many problems in the world. The United States were better off if we work with others. And I think you're going to see one of the challenges for the Biden administration is, how does it seek to emphasize some of those, while at the same time making sure that those alliances and institutions focus on core U.S. interests, whether economic, security, or our values. So that's an ongoing tension in the system. But I sort of reject the notion that, America first has to mean that America only, as opposed to America in cooperation with others.
And another question, the CU professor asks, some have claimed that President Trump's foreign policy approach is more a continuation of President Obama's approach than a departure, in the sense that both were rather isolationist. Do you agree?
Well, it's an interesting question, and let me set the context for it. The last chapter of my book deals with George Herbert Walker Bush, so Bush 41, the 41st president, which ends in 92. But this seminar that I mentioned, faculty and graduate students convinced me I couldn't end there. So they said, you need to deal with more recent time periods. I didn't want to go too far into the present because as a practitioner, as well as someone who's studying the history, in some ways you want the history to settle a little bit. I didn't want to be accused of a partisan perspective. So I wrote an afterword where I focused on the four presidents after Bush 41. So this was Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and a little bit of Trump. And I used the five traditions that Mark has mentioned as kind of the framework. And a little bit to my surprise, because having lived through this area, you live through all the political debates, more than I suspected, there's a continuity that actually starts with Bush 41, who's only a one-term president, but whether it's the Middle East, whether it's trade, whether it's alliance relationships, that is, in a sense, continued in various ways, even though very different people, with both Clinton and Bush 43, although clearly divergence in policies. I note that President Obama, in some ways, starts to make a turn. And I share an experience that when I was working with President Obama at his very first multilateral summit at the London Economic Summit meeting in shortly after he was elected. And I do think that President Obama had a reserve, in some ways a distance, that, and of course, he's dealing with a global financial crisis. He's got a lot of challenges at home that I wouldn't by any means say isolationist, but it was kind of a pullback. And then, of course, Trump represents a very sharp shift on those issues. Not always a pullback, not isolationist, just as I mentioned, a very transactional approach, and an approach that very much links his political base, which his base was of people that had resentments and frustrations and felt left out. And he channels it into issues like the wall with Mexico or the trade protectionism. Since foreign policy is always connected to domestic policy, in some ways this isn't a shock, but I think more than most, you can see those as symbolic of what he was trying to communicate as being a president that was going to be different from his predecessors. So I do think I wouldn't by any means draw the line to say, well, it starts with Obama and then Obama and Trump are similar. There certainly weren't. But you do see some of the shifts in history. Obama used to have a phrase that he liked about saying, we'll rely on the arc of history. And while I knew what he meant, from my experience, you sometimes as a diplomat, you had to be pushing that arc a little bit yourself.
Indeed. We have Andrew, a CU alum at Estes Park, Colorado, asking, I wonder if you noticed any differences in dealing with governments that were more centralized compared to those that were more decentralized.
Well, that's an interesting question. The first thought that goes through my mind is actually my development experience. Because what one often encountered is that as developing countries, sometimes ones that became democracies or moved from authoritarian systems, had to deal with economic challenges, they often had some very good talent at the central government level, the technocratic level. But if they were large, such as a Brazil or an India or Mexico, you often combined a democratization movement with a federalization movement. So you had state authority, and often the capacity at the state level was not as good. And often you had problems of corruption at the state level. And so one of the challenges of development actually was we tried to focus some of our efforts on building the capacities at some of the state level. This is one of the challenges that we'll encounter with Mexico today. The state governments are not, frankly, at the same level of transparency or law enforcement or judicial, and particularly at different sort of parts of Mexico. More generally, in terms of decentralized systems, it's mainly useful to understand their history. So, for example, this is an issue that Britain has to deal with today. Britain was historically a centralized system, including with Scotland and Wales, or for a time, Ireland or Northern Ireland. That was a different tradition than the American federal tradition. Germany, after World War II, builds on the American tradition and has the power of the different states. And so if you try to understand German politics today or how to get things done, you need to understand what's done at the state level. Obviously, our neighbors to the north, Canada, that's a confederation, even sort of looser than a federation. So what I would really suggest is my point, which Mark and I started about, sort of pragmatism and understanding how other countries' system works. You need to get a feel for that in kind of the history. If you take China today, you can't understand Chinese politics without having an appreciation of the Chinese fear that authority will spin away from the emperors or the leaders in Beijing. And so there's a conscious effort where they shift around the provincial party secretaries and the governors so that they don't have too much of a local identity. At the same time, there's a famous concept about in China about, the emperor is far away and not so easy to see everything that's being done. So at the start of this pandemic in Wuhan, you could see that part of the centralized control that Xi Jinping had added made people unwilling to give bad information to the top. So systems vary, and it's just important to understand their history and their strengths and weaknesses.
It is indeed. We have several more questions I want to try to squeeze in here. One comes from Alexander, a CU student from Thornton, and he's wondering about the conditionality on foreign aid. And what do you think we can do to work towards eliminating these Western terms and conditions? And if you're not for eliminating them, making the case for them, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, conditionality is often a very loaded term. In a sense, if you believe that there are conditions that should fight corruption, then you think that's a good idea for transparency or to make sure the money goes where it's supposed to go. Others might see them as putting too many requirements on the recipient. And then there's conditions that may be related to the nature of the economic reforms, whether they be at the macroeconomic level or whether they be sort of leveraged to get people to open up things for the private sector and sort of have the basis of the policy. We started by talking about the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan was based on the idea that the Europeans would come up with their own approaches, but the United States was definitely arguing that Europe needed to integrate and move from a series of small markets to sort of creating an effective market sector economy for the private sector. So I think there are a couple dimensions. A lot depends on how it's done. In general, my experience with development is if the locals don't own it, it's not going to succeed. So part of it is to explain what others have done effectively in developing world with different programs. And then, of course, from your donors, they're going to want to have some sense of what the accountability, and you have to be attentive to that issue going forward and making sure that the resources don't end up in somebody's pocket and sort of make things worse. And I come back actually to the transparency issues being quite important. So just to give you a sense, again, at the World Bank, I tried to push an open data and open budget initiative so that countries would at least publicize for their own publics as well as others how they were using the money, where it was being spent. And the wonderful thing about data technology is we started to get to the point where we could, sort of put online all our different projects in the parts of the country with the idea that people could eventually punch them up, and the locals might also be able to say, well, this is what you think's going on, but let me tell you what's really going on, and sort of have that sort of feedback. So I think one of the questions of conditionality is, is making sure you also understand what the aid is for and the overall purpose. And what I'm thinking about here is that in some cases of basic humanitarian aid in a crisis, when it's a question of people starving or food or after a natural disaster, you're going to have a different type of system. When I was dealing with Darfur and I had, millions of people in camps, it was basically a challenge of just trying to get open conditions for some of the NGOs that operate there. So I guess what I'm trying to explain with a lot of these foreign policy issues, it's often not a black or white. You have to understand what you're trying to achieve, and you got to try to operate with some basic principles. And frankly, you need to often have feedback loops, whether it's within a country or internationally. You need information flows, because no matter how well-intended people are, they'll make mistakes, and that happens in life. It happens with startups. And one of the lessons is you then need to figure it out and correct your mistakes.
Well, we have, speaking of crises, we have 3 questions related to Myanmar. Susan's wondering, in regard to the military coup in Myanmar, why can't the U.S. intervene and provide aid? Andrea, the faculty member and chair of our diversity committee at the Boulder Faculty Assembly, is saying, or at least why can't the U.S. condemn the violence as our European allies have done? And Alexander is wondering, what do you think is America's responsibility to act? So 3 questions.
Yeah, well, again, you have to decide in the case of a country like Myanmar, how far are we willing to go and with what effectiveness? So we've had similar situations over time where we didn't like coups, and the question would be, do we want to go so far as to try to use military action to force somebody out of power? I don't think people want to invade Myanmar. I don't think that that's as far as they want to go. And then the question is, well, should we use sanctions? And then you have to ask yourself, what type of sanctions? Will the sanctions basically hurt people, a lot of the general public, or remove the businesses there that a lot of them have a livelihood on? Maybe you want to do that. That was done with South Africa, but it's very costly. And to give you a very practical sense, I help some development organizations now that have, for example, microcredit operations in Myanmar, and these are dealing with the very poorest people. They have to decide, do they have to pull those out? Or Mercy Corps does a lot of operations there of a humanitarian aid. My own sense is that you want to keep the door open for humanitarian support, make sure that people have basic livelihoods. But as you do that, one has to recognize you're probably going to have to work with some degree of the established authorities. And then you get into a gray area. Are you supporting them? Are you legitimating them? As one of the questions asked, so should you condemn? I think the US has condemned in Myanmar. But again, then one also has to ask, how will we be most effective? And Myanmar is one of the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. And you'll notice there's a sensitivity among some of the other Southeast Asian countries, in part because they're not all democracies, but in part also because they're worried about, if they push Myanmar away, will that just strengthen China's hand? Will it mean that China will have more influence in the country? So these are the trade-offs that you have to deal with in a situation like that. Now, people will recall, I first dealt with Myanmar when you had a military authority and Aung San Suu Kyi was being under house arrest. People got hopeful when her party was allowed to win elections. But then, of course, what we saw with the treatment of the Rohingya and being pushed out made people rather frustrated with Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, how much of that was sort of ethnic cleansing? How much of it was done by the military? In a lot of these issues, I'm afraid there's not going to be a black or white choice. And then you have to decide, where can the US have influence? Where can it have influence with others? And what are the ultimate objectives? So in sum, for a country like Myanmar, I would try to make sure that you kept open the possibilities for humanitarian support. And beyond that, I would look to see if you could work with others on some of the basic needs programs, like I mentioned, microcredit and others, to keep things, possibilities of things going for people. But at the end of the day, you also have to take a close watch at the courageous action of people on the ground. And I think one of the most amazing stories of Myanmar, formerly Burma, was, under these extremely horrible conditions, the courage of these people trying to stand up for freedom is absolutely amazing.
It is indeed, and inspiring, and thank you for your there. Some CU professors asking, some presidents are more inwardly focused, concentrating on domestic issues, and others are more outward facing. What explains this?
Well, it's often the times and the circumstance. So, I mean, let's take a present situation. President Biden had a lot of international experience. He's interested in the international area. But if you talk to his White House team, they're probably being guided by the guidance that my former boss, James Baker, gave to Reagan in early 1981 when he was chief of staff, where he said, Mr. President, you have three priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery. So Al Haig wanted to threaten Cuba, and the White House said, we don't want to threaten Cuba. We want to focus on economic recovery. Well, for the Biden administration, their success, at least through the start of the presidency, will be dealing with pandemic and economic recovery. And then secondly, if you think about the issues they've got issues such as immigration, infrastructure issues, environmental topics. And I think what you'll see them do is they'll try to leverage those issues on the home front in their international policy. So with climate change or immigration with Mexico and Central America. At the same time, and this is another way of answering your question, there was a British Prime Minister named Harold Macmillan, who, after he was reelected, was asked about his plans, and he said, events, dear boy, events. I never totally like that, because I like officials that come in with an idea of a program, but there's something to that. And what I mean by this is, if you tell me what's going to happen with Iran or North Korea or other actions with China or Russia, that will also guide how the Biden administration works. So the wonderful irony again of history, which is rich with it, is Woodrow Wilson, who was elected in 1916, said, or 1912, said that it was one of the great ironies would be he saw himself as a domestic president, and he had a heck of a first term with domestic action. But he said, would it be a tremendous irony if his presidency depended on international issues, which of course it did.
Fate sometimes deals a different hand. Final question. We have a CU student asking, what is your vision, prediction of America's future foreign policy? What do you see as the key issues? Who will be the key players? Your chance to predict as you close and wrap up.
Well, in some ways, I come back to those four traditions, or the five traditions. So the starting point, of course, is always what we do at home. So whether it's our democracy, whether it's our economy, we need to approach the world with a certain amount of humility, but our biggest asset is the message we send the world, and both our strength, but also the model that we send. And then related to that, of course, I think it's important that we have a strong continental base with North America, as I've talked about. I think our alliance relations, whether from a geopolitical perspective about the maritime shores of Eurasia, so this would be the East Asia and India, all the way to Western Europe, those relations are important to our security, our economics, our value system. And I think that one of the problems the Biden administration is actually going to have is, for domestic political reasons, it's going to be sluggish on trade. And I think you need to have a very important sort of international economic component of that. And coming back, one of the traditions we didn't talk about was America's purpose. And I'll leave you with a little anecdote on this one, is that for those of you that still carry wallets and cash, someday look at the back of a dollar bill and you'll see what's called the Great Seal of the United States maybe you've never given it much attention. On the reverse of the Great Seal, you see this unfinished pyramid. And notice it's unfinished. And there's an eye of providence above it, and the words below it, Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So what you can see is over 200 years, Americans were trying to think about not only the nation they were trying to build, but their role in the world, a new order of the ages. I personally believe that the US resilience and a lot of its basic attributes, while we make mistakes, that our strength as a society is best our openness, not closing it off, openness to goods, to capital, to ideas, to people. That's what makes us attractive to the rest of the world. So I think the United States has got huge potential going forward, but it all depends on what we've been talking about today, the leaders and the public support.
Well, thank you all for joining us. A special thanks to Bob and all the speakers who have volunteered their time to join this year's Conference on World Affairs. If you would like to support them and learn more about their work, you can find their books, podcasts, and social media accounts linked on the CWA website. The CWA relies on the generosity of people like you to make this event possible. Please consider making a gift to the CWA, which can be done by going to the CWA website at colorado.edu/CWA. Tune in through Sunday, April 11th for live CWA events, or catch us for those you've missed on our CWA YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks, Bob, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.